On today's special Nostalgia 101, Dan records live from the Southwest Popular American Culture Association Conference in New Mexico with Jen Sopchockchai Bankard and P.T. McNiff of the Long Take Review podcast. Class is in session, nerds. Welcome to the Nostalgia Test Podcast, the show where two longtime friends put their mainstream pop culture past to the ultimate test, the Nostalgia Test. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Nostalgia Test Podcast. I'm Dan, your host here in LA, and just wanted to do a little intro before you hear this amazing live podcast recording from the Southwest Popular American Culture Association Conference in New Mexico. I had the pleasure of putting this together with Jen Sopchockchai Bankard and P.T. McNiff of the Long Take Review, and it was an amazing experience. We learned a lot about taping a podcast live. This is audio only. We still have yet to deal with the video part, but mainly like our whole conversation was a roundtable talk called Between Two Scholastic Worlds, Teaching, Blogging, and Podcasting. And really what we were trying to do is kind of talk about how we as academics are trying to straddle that line between like pop culture and academia and how we mix the worlds together. You're going to hear Jen and PT talk about how the Long Take Review discusses and breaks down rhetorical points in movies and television shows. You're going to hear me talk about how Nostalgia Test Podcast has morphed from being a comedy-only podcast to Nostalgia 101 with international academics. And also even in the comedy part, how much we learned, Manny and I, from doing this work for the past like almost 3 or 4 years now, and 100 or so episodes in. And then we have some amazing questions from the audience. This was a round table, so their participation was definitely necessary. Shout out to all the people who asked questions in the audience. Thank you so much for coming to the presentation. Thank you so much for the support. Shout out to the Southwest Popular Culture Conference. It was always an amazing time there. I always have a great time, and this was a special one. And shout out to the tech guy who helped us put this all together. You'll hear as we come into the episode how we were having some tech issues in the beginning, but that's podcasting, so we left that in so you can kind of get a taste of what's going on. So without further ado, the live podcast episode Between Two Scholastic Worlds, Teaching, Blogging, and Podcasting with me, Dan Dissinger from the Nostalgia Test Podcast, and Jen and PT from the Long Take Review. And they're all recording, right?
Theoretically.
Well, where's mine?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
And that's up too. Okay.
A round of applause for this gentleman.
This was all set up for this whole conversation because this is the hardest part about podcasting is technology. Well, thank you all for being here at what is a live podcast recording. Thankfully, none of that is actually in the recording, so that's actually amazing. And actually, I was looking on the schedule. We are actually the only podcast-centric panel this year, which is really great. And hopefully I got that right. And I think there hasn't been a podcast-centric panel since 2019, so it's really exciting. There's been other podcasters presenting, and more power to them. And I would love to meet them because this is a really growing medium. But I am Dan Dissinger. I am one half of the Nostalgia Test Podcast. I'm a teacher at University of Southern California, and I'm here to talk about podcasting and teaching and pedagogy. And I'm here with my two colleagues from USC who are going to introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Jen Sopchockchai Bankard. I write television and film reviews on my Substack, The Long Take, and a subset of that is the Long Take Review podcast, which we're going to be talking about today, and we'll say more about it in a minute. And this is my co-host.
Great. I'm P.T. McNiff, already introduced as a co-host of the Long Take Review podcast. I just rode Jen's coattails into being on a podcast and now on a panel. So thank you for coming, and thank you again for your patience.
Yes. Thank you.
We've never podcasted in person.
No, this is the first time.
It's pretty weird.
Yeah.
It is.
I'm not gonna
pretty
lie.
weird.
In the end, 15 minutes isn't too bad for a technical delay.
That's true.
It isn't too bad. Usually that gets edited straight out of the podcast when there's any technical delay. But yeah, our presentation, here it is. So go ahead, long take review.
All right. So the Long Take Review podcast is essentially for writing professors. So the thing we should have mentioned probably is all three of us are colleagues at USC. We work together. We're writing professors. And so for our show, it's essentially for writing professors who really love film. And so our show kind of came from just our love of film and sort of like hallway chats that eventually evolved into a podcast. Our sort of angle is that we are focused on the Oscar race a lot of the time, or we have one eye on the Oscar race. That's mostly to sort of make it inclusive. If we want to talk about just any film, like or a blockbuster or something like that, we can do that, but our sort of like our angle is always peeking over at the Oscar race and award season. And this is a typical screenshot of us recording. I wanted to include that in there.
I'm talking. That makes sense.
That's true.
That sounds like
It tracks.
Yep. But our two other co-hosts, Antonio Elefano and Greg Cass, could not be here. But as Jen said, also writing professors, and two, the public sort of are on the surface, as Jen said, it's movie talk, looking at awards things, but the episodes are a mix, a combination, reviews of new releases that have sort of non-spoiler as well as spoiler sections, and we because we have that one eye, we're talking about these sort of potential awards contenders, the sort of already high level movies, but we also like sort of popular blockbuster things. We all have our nerdy franchise interests, which may not have that much luck at the Oscars, but that's okay. We'll also do reactions to sort of award season checkpoints, film festivals, precursor awards, and sort of say, okay, well, what's happening out there? Some just like movie hype drafts and trailer reactions to try to have short-ish episodes, but it is not called the Short Take Review, so the episodes usually go pretty long. And this year we did our own award show called the LTRs, or the letters, where we sort of said what our favorite movies were of the year, and sort of the four of us had to get together. We shared and we voted like in an episode to come to a consensus of who and what we awarded.
Yeah, so what PT just described is sort of, if you're not an academic listening to our show, sort of what it looks like. But the part of the name, the Long Take, came from a desire to sort of infuse more scholarly discourse and sort of embrace the idea that we are long-winded academics who like to talk about things in depth and for a long time. And so that's sort of how the title of the show came about. But we try to, while maintaining a sort of popular audience appeal for a show, we do have ways that we are trying to kind of sneak in a palatable way, things that we talk about in our teaching lives, in our scholarly lives, primarily from the field of rhetoric and composition, but also, English literature. One of us was a lawyer. That comes in handy with certain types of movies, and creative writing and nonfiction writing and all kinds of things. So some of the ways in which we do that is by having different segments that sort of are either driven by concepts in rhetorical theory. So our recommendation algorithm is sort of acknowledging not every film is for everyone, and we are establishing the audience of that particular film, and that's what that segment is all about, sort of like, who are you recommending this to if it's not going to appeal to everyone. And then the rhetorical situation is probably our most overt attempt to present academic concepts, because we just kind of make a designated space for what are some connections from our academic lives that we sort of thought about while we were watching a film, or connections that we see in the discourse surrounding a film. Our most recent episode was about the zone of interest, so there was obviously a lot of discussion about the representation of history and sort of genre and form and all that kind of stuff. So and then obviously, I was talking to Katie Rich, who's the host of the Vanity Fair's Oscars podcast. And she was like, oh, what's your show about? And I said, we do sort of like English major deep dives on these movies. And she was like, oh, and she like immediately knew what that meant. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do in our sort of back half of every episode where we review a film. We are sort of like trying to bring that kind of close reading approach that we would want from a scholarship and we want from our students. And then periodically, there are a lot of parallels that we draw between when we're grading a student paper and sort of what factors into that to also evaluating a film. Both a student paper and a film are sort of subjective pieces of art and creativity. And so, sometimes the challenges in that are very similar.
So that's our show, The Long Take Review. Dan, would you like to talk about the nostalgia test?
Yeah, sure. So I started the nostalgia test with a friend of mine on Long Island. He is a film student, or was a film student, and now he is a co-owner and a master brewer at a brewery in Farmingdale, Long Island. So two different worlds, right? I'm here in LA. I'm in LA, so it's a bi-coastal podcast. And also I'm in like the academic world, English major, rhetoric composition teacher, but also super interested in knowing, do the things of our past, like our childhood pop culture, is it still good? And like, what kind of eyes are we looking at them now, right? So cartoons, movies, even food. We've gone back and eaten food that we're just like, well, we loved this when we were kids. Total bad idea. It was a horrible idea to do, but it's something that you learn, right? These are experiential, educational journeys that we're having, right? And at the same time, as we were talking about like grading a student paper, the nostalgia test has a rubric, okay? How does the nostalgia test work? This is our little chaotic rubric of how it works. So everything we put to the nostalgia test has to be at least 10 years old. We don't know why. It just was a number that came up. It was a very comfortable number that we thought 10 years sounds good. It gives us a decade between things, so it's good enough distance. Anything that is put to the test must be rewatched, re-listened to, eaten, drunk, played, etc., unless it's too hard to obtain. So there are some things that you can actually get, so we have to just kind of go off memory. But it's important, and anytime we have a guest, we have to tell them, like, you have to rewatch the movie. Because a lot of people don't want to do that. They just want to like go, oh, I love this movie. You loved it then. We have to do it now. So this is like part of the rubric, right? When it passes the nostalgia test, it means it's still good. It has withstood this test of time. We would recommend it. We were talking as well, like for a couple days, thinking about like, would we also think about, like, I think PT you said, or Jen, like, would I recommend this to a student? And like, if it's a yes, then I guess that it passes the nostalgia test. If it's a no, then that's the thing. If it fails, it could be just nostalgic, which we talked to someone from Vienna all about nostalgia, which I'll talk about. And he said, we came up with this idea, just because something's nostalgic does not mean that it's good, but it makes you feel good, or it brings you back to this moment when you were experiencing it. So that means it fails, but it's still nostalgic. And then there's the ultimate fail. It's not good anymore. It's terrible. We would like to erase this from our histories, or like we came up with, it's Three Musketeers candy bar bad, because that's one of the worst things that we went to redo. Of course, it's subjective, right? This is the fun part of it, right? Because some people might love that, and more power to you.
I wanted on record that the two of us, we talked about this. We were okay with Three Musketeers.
Yeah, you need to dial down. Three Musketeers.
It's definitely lower tier, but I'm still eating it. I don't know.
All right, so it's Take Your Pants Off and Jacket bad from Blink-182. That's how bad that album was. So there's a lot of things that were super bad, right? I think I didn't like Airborne, the movie, so that was another one for me. So that's like the rubric for the nostalgia test. And then these are some like notable episodes that we talked about, but some of them actually taught us some things, right? So it's not just about the fun, right? Because it is fun. So Cocktail, the Tom Cruise movie from 1988, was the first movie we did. And one of the things we learned, that it was based on a novel, which we didn't know that it was based on a novel. And it actually taught us that a lot of movies from the 80s were also based on novels. Die Hard, based on a novel written in 1979, right? Cobra, a horrible Stallone movie, that was also based on a novel. Rambo's based on a novel. A lot of these movies based on novels, and we just couldn't understand how Cocktail was based on a novel. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie from 1990, It grossed $202 million. It was one of the most successful independent films of all time. Okay, we didn't know that either. First, we didn't know it was an independent film, right? So there's like a lot of lessons that we're learning going back through our pop culture. Pringles can't legally call itself a potato chip because it's not a slice of potato. So these things kind of seemed weird when we were talking about them, but it actually opened it up to kind of going, wow, there's so much behind these things that we just take for granted. Pringles, this movie, these novels, these TV shows. And that Gremlins actually helped usher in PG-13. Okay, so before Gremlins and I think Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, there was no PG-13 rating. Some other ones that we had the director on from the Orange Years, the Nickelodeon story documentary, that was super amazing, and how important Nickelodeon of the 90s was and how it set up a very important space for not just like creative animation that was just brand new, but also like shows that had female-centered characters, right? Nickelodeon was very ahead of its time doing that. The Rocky film ushered in the Steadicam and sports montages. It was like one of the films to first do that. We talked to the Q*bert creator, which that was so eye-opening to understand that Q*bert wasn't even supposed to be a game. It was only supposed to be a coding exercise that then ended up becoming a smash arcade hit. And then Mrs. Doubtfire, which a movie we all thought we loved as children, really sets up a tone for Robin Williams' character being like the lowest bar for fathers ever, and all he had to do was keep a job, clean the house a little bit, discipline his kids, and the journey he went through to do that was totally ridiculous. So, and it's also just one of many films where like fatherhood is the low bar for fatherhood. So there's like a lot of deep readings that we do. Once we started getting towards episodes 50, 60, and 70, we opened up new things, Nostalgia Test Now, which we look at things that are younger than 10 years, so brand new things. And our big thing is stopping the reboots of movies, particularly Roadhouse. So if you want to help us out, hashtag #NotMyDalton is the campaign to stop the Roadhouse reboot, even though it's probably is coming out anyway. But to make sure that everyone knows this is a terrible idea. And it's not just because of our love of the 80s, but because of what they did to the Dalton character. When it comes out, now he's a UFC fighter, and he's not some holder of a master's in philosophy. He's not this mysterious character. He's really, the bar for, like, it's almost like the bar for masculinity like goes away, and it's more hyper masculine, and it's much more violent. Where like he didn't want to be violent in the first Roadhouse. It was like the last resort. So it's interesting to kind of see like what they did with it. And then we opened it up to academics across the world, Nostalgia 101. And each one of these people came on to teach us about nostalgia. And there's Jen. She came on too. So we had someone from Vienna come in and talk about nostalgia. Someone from India talk about American culture and post-liberalization. Jen talked about going to nerd school, which that was a really fun episode. Cult TV and telenovelas. That academic from Brazil. That episode is amazing. All things comedy. And this is about horror films. It was supposed to be about Are You Afraid of the Dark, but then it became an analysis of how mental health issues are dealt with in horror, and how characters with mental health issues are portrayed in horror films. So it actually became very deep. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dan. I think that, across both of our shows, we sort of have, and in our discussions building up to this panel, this sort of existential question of like, are we academic podcasters or podcasting academics? And how much we're talking about the pop culture is sort of the lead, and we're not no disrespect to all the good people who are at an academic conference who came here to listen, but like that's not the only audience that we were aiming towards. And so, yeah, I guess a question we have there's a bunch of questions we have been mulling over, and we won't answer all of them yet. But if we don't get audience questions, we probably will. But like what I'll ask my co-panelists of like what do you think about like where the line is in terms of how far is it too far to bring the academia into a conversation without losing a lay audience?
I feel like it often comes down to context and knowledge. And so the interesting thing that I catch myself doing on our show all the time is stopping, because all four of us who are on the show are in the same discourse community, right? We're all academics. We all sort of like can drop a term and move on, and we know what it means. And so I have sort of had to train myself to sort of stop and shift, because, you know, the premise of a podcast is that we're talking to each other, right, and recording it. But when you're thinking about this whole other audience of people listening at home, I have to then have this other brain going in the background being like, wait, are people going to know what that is? Do I have to stop and explain that? And so, you know, and we're still working on it. I keep tripping over when I introduce the rhetorical situation. I eventually was like, I'm never mentioning that we're professors, and that's why we're doing this. So this is going to seem completely random to everyone listening to this. And so it really has taken a lot of work over time to sort of like be making it so that it's applicable to both types of listeners, because we do have our colleagues and friends and family, other people who are academics, but really stopping and being like, so for those of you who don't know, like I find myself doing that all the time. How about you, Dan?
Well, so I do another podcast called Writing Remix, which is like a much more, I guess we would say, quote unquote, academic podcast. So we have writers and and teachers on. We talk about pedagogy. We talk about books. We talk about current events and things like that. But one thing I found is that, you know, especially because my co-host isn't another professor, right? My co-host for the Nostalgia Test is my friend Manny, who is a brewer, and he is someone who just loves film and loves, you know, pop culture. When we introduced the Nostalgia 101, he was super nervous. Like, he was like, what am I going to bring to the table to talk to these PhDs about? He pretty much leads the conversation. I mean, he has so many questions and he's so curious. And the one thing I'm finding is that maybe it's the term academic that gets in the way of this idea of like this like cipher of intellectual discourse that we're having, right? Because like that's what we're doing. And I see crossover, because even the episode with the director of the Orange Years, he came on Writing Remix as well. So I think there's space for both. And I think like even the professors that came on, I told them to listen to our podcast, because our podcast is very, it's you know, we're not thinking of an academic audience. There's like a lot of yelling, talking over people. We're both from New York, so when we get in a room together, we get all New York about everything. And there's, you know, some bad language and whatever. But when the academics come on, they just mix it up with us exactly the same way. And they have a good time. And I think they tell us afterwards, they're like, that was so low pressure. And also, they come to conferences and they might have 15 minutes to say something, and then they're like on our show and they have an hour 20, and we really get into some deeper conversation. So I feel like we have to be aware of our audience, but at the same time, like for the Nostalgia Test, I'm like, I want my audience to like, I want to bring this other part of my world to them. And those episodes actually sometimes do way better than the episodes that I'm thinking are going to do well. Like I'm like, everyone's going to love the episode about Toy Story. It was hilarious. It was great. And then it doesn't get as many listens. And then we like do this one about, you know, telenovelas and stuff like that. And that one, like the downloads go straight, you know, way like double or triple that. So I think people want to have those conversations in the pop culture space. And I think like the lay audience or the academic audience, like, I think they can mix pretty well. I think it's, you know, because it's pop culture, and that's the thing. What
I've noticed from listening to the Nostalgia 101 episodes is that the academics, you're right, they are much more relaxed than they probably would be on a panel like this. Maybe not quite like this, but on a panel, I guess I should say. But they also get to talk about sort of their personal connection to the thing they're studying. They get to talk about, well, I grew up watching this, and that's why I became interested in this issue, because when I studied X, like I realized why, right? And so you get kind of the complete picture of both their work and their research, but also sort of their relationship to the topic, which is really fun.
Yeah, and I think that the crossover isn't just in that direction of sort of, I get to show the personal, but I think there's also in the, like Dan, you were sort of referencing the lay audience, there's a hunger for some of these insights and some of the perspectives. And like you were saying about Mandy, it seems daunting and it seems overwhelming, where it's like, well, I don't know what that is and I can't possibly understand that. But when it's sort of, oh, well, you're thinking about this, here's just another little like spin, here's another angle to look at it. It's like, oh, I guess that does make sense. And they can start to, I mean, I'm getting delusions of grandeur that it's like, and then they change their lives. But they start to, they can start to incorporate that into their approach, their thinking, their critical evaluation.
Absolutely.
So, we had a few things that were listed in our in our panel thing. We mostly want this to be a conversation. We spend a lot of time now talking about our shows and setting up our microphones. But if I guess if folks have questions about either the process or the product, we've been sort of talking a lot of process-based, but also if there's sort of product-based things around the kind of things that we've been talking about. I mean, Barbenheimer is the big, that's been on multiple panels around here. Nostalgia, of course, toxic fandom, reboots. These are topics that keep coming up, I think, across. Sure. You guys didn't do Barbenheimer yet, but in 2033,
about 20,
you can do it.
Exactly.
But yeah, so if we have more questions for each other, because we talk to each other all the time and we love it. But there's a microphone if anyone has questions, things they want to ask about, bring up, contribute.
Yeah. Or if you just want to ask your question, because I don't even know if that microphone is mic'd up. So
we'll find out.
Yeah.
So I noticed. Okay, I noticed that you guys cover a lot of material and that sort of thing, classic movies. Have you ever done an episode where you covered 90s hood flicks?
Ooh.
We mostly are only doing only doing new movies on our show, so we get to just look at you, Dan, and put you on the spot.
We haven't done that yet. We've done some. We've done a couple hip hop episodes that went and also the thing was like, it makes us reflect on what we've consumed as pop culture, right? In pop culture. So a lot of times when we talk about what we're going to put on the show, we have the conversations about like, wow, what we've done has been, you can see like, is this very super white, or it's part of our experience. And so we're like, our identity and our identities and our journeys come into it. But we've done things like we did the Fugees album, and we did the second Jadakiss album, and we're coming up on hopefully putting The Last Dragon on. That's like something that we really want to do, and it's something that we always consider when we're looking at the content that we're doing, because we also don't want to like misrepresent what we're doing, right? That's a big concern in terms of like being out there, as I think more for me as an academic, where like someone can be like, well, but you don't know any of this and blah blah blah. But like, I think we're expanding into those things and looking at some of the other stuff that we've done and what we've seen. So like, I do think things like Menace to Society is going to probably come up, Boys in the Hood, and things that we've seen, but it's all, and I'm going to be pretty honest, it's all very surface to the point of like, how deep can we go? But we're always open to having guests on that want to talk about that. So you could we would love to have those conversations. But truthfully, when we go into other movies and we look at it, we're just like, wow, like we did The Wedding Singer by Adam Sandler. It was a very disappointing watch. It was a very disappointing watch. But we do call out everything that we're seeing. We're like, wow, this is super, offensive towards all the jokes are about marginalized communities. That's where the butt of the joke is coming in. All the characters are white. There's not many, characters of color. Or when we do see that, we're just like, what are their role? So like, even when we're not having the academic conversation, we know the things we've noticed, we're just like, we have to call this out for what it is, because if we're doing this nostalgia type test, and if it doesn't pass the test, and we wouldn't recommend it because of certain specific reasons, we have to put that out there. And so we want to go deeper, but also at sometimes we say like, we need a guide into some of those things because we only know so much of what we've consumed. Yeah.
And I will say, despite having thrown it to you, as we mostly only do new movies, there's a push within the long take review community to do more sort of historical, like look back, like when we are discussing like this year's nominations, we're like, well, what would we change if we had, magical powers, if we were the Oscar fairy? How would we like sprinkle dust to like take this person out and put that person in? And there's like at least a couple of us, and it's not Jen. So that's why I'm saying it that way.
I know, you're
who are
looking
like,
at me.
we want to go back. So like, why isn't Spike Lee winning for Do the Right Thing? Why isn't Do the Right Thing winning?
Right.
Why is John Singleton winning? Like, what is it up against? Like, and trying to figure out how can we rearrange this and get like a better history that's not inclusive, but more inclusive than it has been. So yeah, that could be a path for us to tap into some of those genres that are not, of their time and also have been neglected in the conversations we would normally have.
Yeah, and we are coming up potentially on a dead zone because of the strike. Oscars are March 10th. Then we're suddenly going to run out of content. And if anyone has any ideas like this is great. I'm like, we should be writing this down.
We're recording it.
Oh, that's
Thank
true.
you.
The beauty of podcasting.
So I don't know if that actually got picked up, but like we'll pick up that volume in there. Excellent. No, yeah, I have to watch.
True.
I'm watching the monitors. Got to watch the monitors. Excellent. Someone else have a question, or they want to say we could repeat it, just so that. Yeah. So the question is, do we make use of our podcasts in the classroom? So
I haven't yet. The main thing I do is I talk about my experience creating the podcast to my students when I'm trying to sort of model or talk about the writing process or the creation process. And I sort of reference my own challenges and things that we've had to do, things we run into, as a way to kind of be like, I'm doing this alongside you. I'm just doing something else, not your assignment. And so that's the main way that I think it's been helpful. But I teach a lot of pre-health students, and so it's hard to be like, and today we're going to talk about pop culture.
Yeah, in terms of the process versus product dynamic, it is. I have only really similarly used it as a process example of, and here's how we approach things. Here's how, like, a problem that I face that may be similar to something that the students are doing. Audience recognition, figuring out how to best explain something, not overwriting or over talking, which is something that can happen. So I haven't quite figured out how we can get the actual content into the class, but we also were talking about pitching a new class during lunch.
Right,
So maybe within a year or two we can find a way to do it. Dan, have you ever done Writing Remix or Nostalgia?
Well, Writing Remix, the Writing Remix podcast that I do, which is like more teaching focused and writing focused, I've assigned episodes, I've given students episodes as source material because there's also a lot of notes on it. Like I take a lot of notes for the podcast with links to certain things. With the nostalgia test, I've started introducing ideas of pop culture, and I'm trying to look through the episodes and be like, these are the ones that I can use. So I think the Nostalgia 101 episodes are definitely the episodes that I'm going to start kind of using in the class, because something I want them to see, because I do a lot of multimodal work in my class, so students are doing podcasts, students are doing short films, students are creating surveys, doing interviews. So I want them to kind of know how to kind of do those things. So I use myself as like, here are the mistakes I made. Here are the things that I've done well. And it allows me also to stay, to have more references for them when I'm talking about certain things. Because a lot of the times I'm talking to students and they might not understand a lot of things that I'm doing. So like if I could pull up my podcast and go listen to a clip like of something, then we could do that. But definitely bringing the nostalgia test into it is going to, take a little more work because it's a little more comedy focused. Mm-hmm. But the Writing Remix, I've used that all the time in my class. As
everyone was talking, I just thought of it to give an example of sort of how I would use my own experience as a writer and a podcaster. When I teach students now, and I think this is the thing that has emerged as the most like regular. I've busted it out many times now. When I teach students about unconscious bias in their writing, I use, I was reviewing Raya and the Last Dragon, which I don't know if anyone remembers, not the movie necessarily, but it came out during the pandemic. And it was a big deal that Disney Plus, it went straight to Disney Plus, it didn't go to theaters, and they were charging $30 to stream it. And I think the concept was like, well, you'd at least spend $20 if you were going to see it in the theater, and now everyone in your house can watch it at home, right? There's all this like economics that went into it. And in my review, I sort of, without thinking about it, wrote the question, is it worth the $30? Because I sort of thought that's something people will want to know when they're reading your review. And then I had to stop and say, well, but what $30 means to me and how much money that is to me in sort of like my background, my context, could be very different than someone who's reading this. And so then I had to sort of like totally rework the whole thing and revise it. And so I show students the sort of two versions, the before and after, as an example, because oftentimes with a concept like unconscious bias, students find it too abstract, and they're like, well, I'm not trying to be biased, and so I think I'm good. And so showing like, well, here's a way in which like you can sort of catch yourself, and they also don't know how to practically think about that or implement that in their own writing process. And so I try to use that as an example of like, well, this is the thing. Just sort of ask yourself, is the thing I'm saying, how many other people does that apply to, right? And then sort of like build in an acknowledgement of that in the work itself. So.
Yeah. Excellent. Wow, thank you so much. That was a great question. Thank you. Other people, other questions or comments or?
Love it. Do it.
It's not a height issue. I think it's a wiring issue.
Yeah, so just everyone here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point.
Can hear you, yes.
Yeah.
You didn't have to ask it.
I didn't. That was my back pocket question. If you guys didn't have
so
questions.
how do we frame it on our
I was going to ask them so I could figure out how to do it. No, I present it as sort of academic work to the public, and just it's sort of public facing. Is it the same concept as people who are writing op-eds or have their own sort of websites and blogs or high-level social media accounts where they're putting out their academic thoughts, theories, and interpretations. And so, I frame it that way in terms of sort of, I guess, like the service component of our job, and then. I also sort of incorporate it similar to kind of the example that Jen was talking about of how doing this work, sort of creating something and making that and putting that out there. We're not teaching creative writing. We teach sort of ret comp, but it's still composition is still writing, creating things, getting ideas from your head out to someone else. Doing that, engaging in that activity, and doing it in a public way is helpful for me in the classroom because we are all teaching faculty. We're not tenure track. Contact the administration at USC if you would like that to change. So we're very any sort of CV promotion merit review thing is very focused on teaching. So I also frame it as being very helpful for my teaching, even if I don't have as good an example as Jen does of like, here's a thing I show in class, but just like the repetition, the activity of doing it, is helping me stay in touch with what the students are doing and being able to better instruct them, I hope, in how, what they are working on and struggling with. How about you guys?
A lot of the courses that we teach are very process focused. Teaching, especially our first year composition class, mainly the main thing, like you did okay if you managed to teach them to have a writing process that they reflect on. And I think for me, oftentimes I am framing this work as I am an active practitioner of the thing I'm teaching, and I just practically speaking, whenever we talk about process issues, and especially like, because I always end up, even if I don't want to, having the writer's block conversation with my class. I don't know if this happens to either of you.
All the time.
Yes.
Okay. I've never actually talked to anybody about that, so I don't know. It's good to hear. Oftentimes I have a lot more to say about strategies because, putting out a podcast, you really have to do it consistently. And you have to do, and my blog too, like you have to kind of have a regular flow, a regular schedule. Otherwise, people don't know when to tune in. And so that has really, and having gone to grad school for a million years and done a bunch of academic writing and stuff like that, I had sort of lost touch with that sort of like urgency, the deadline, right? Because we're so used to academic publishing being at a glacial pace, which is good for most of us. But like this is a very different thing, and so actually mirrors what the students have to go through doing assignments and having a million things to do, and this is due in 2 days, and how do I get it done? What strategies to use? And so I've had a much more productive conversation, sort of sharing my own experience, being like, I can now sort of more accurately recognize my hangups as a writer and share those with them. And so that's a big thing that sort of I use to frame this work, that it makes me a better teacher because I'm kind of in touch with what the students are struggling with at creating my own work. But yeah, how about you, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say very similar things to both Jen and PT. The one thing that I would say too is that with the Writing Remix podcast and with the Nostalgia Test, that the guests that we have are international. So I really push that idea of like, I am bringing an international exposure to the school, to the program. Here's what we did. I'm also co-founded the Humanities Podcast Network, which also does a virtual symposium. So we do an international virtual symposium. We've done it 3 or 4 years in a row now at this point. So it does seem like a lot more work, but in reality, for me, I've now released 107 episodes of the Nostalgia Test and about 104 episodes of Writing Remix. That's like over 200 episodes podcasting. That is more scholastic work than I can ever think about doing in terms of like sending an article in, waiting for feedback, get my peer review notes, not right. So I like the fact that I can go, someone, and I sent the CFP out for both the Nostalgia Test and the Writing Remix and got a ton of response from academics all over the world. So they want to come on. So it's not like I'm forcing people to come on. They're reaching out to me. So I'm showing that like I'm not just like creating work, I'm also building community. And at the same time, like this work is archival and everyone has access to it. So I try to push this idea of like, I'm doing all these things in this pedagogical way, and I frame it as pedagogy as much as I possibly can. Pair it with some flair, and I pair it with bell hooks and the idea of like, if it's just reaching one audience, who cares? Like, I want everyone to have access to this, right? So it becomes much more about community building for me. And the thing is this, if the Academy doesn't want to recognize the Writing Remix as something scholastic or academic, then that's their prerogative. I'm not going to try to force my podcast through their peer review process, because like that's not what I do it for. It's not an essay, like it's not an article. It's a totally different modality, so I want to celebrate that power of that modality.
But I do think we have the benefit of our institution liking having its name out there in positive ways.
Yes, the PR machine of USC loves to have their name out there. Yeah.
So saying it is like, well, and like we're doing these things even if they're like, we don't care about your podcast, we don't care about these movies or the nostalgia things. It's like, but there are people who are listening, and there's people that you're interacting with that's coming on to these shows and all of that. And even if they don't get it, you can still sort of just say, we're putting some good on USC's name, and then that's like, okay, we understand.
I would also say that if we're thinking very pragmatically about the materials that you have to write for things like reviews and promotion and stuff, there's just language that you have to tap into. So as everybody was talking, I was thinking, well, public intellectual, that's a good one. Multimodal composition. Yes, that's a hot button term that you can use, and everyone's like,
digital humanities.
Digital humanities.
Yes, that too. Oh, I haven't used that one. I should use that one.
No, get on the train.
And so I think it's like, we, by doing this, virtue of doing this, have, I think, really refined our sort of like code switching skills. I guess I can call it that.
It's just another rhetorical situation. It's like, how do you tell the deans? How do you tell the upper mucky mucks that like this all makes sense and say it in words that they understand, and they're saying, that sounds good. We like that.
Yeah.
So that's a very, it's not the short take review. So we'll see if someone else has a question. And then this is like a classroom move. And then we'll come back to you. Were there other questions? It's okay if not.
Well,
Yeah.
No, it's more of a comment. I do my own YouTube thing called Dad
Nice.
Cypher, where I do hip hop and fatherhood. That's what I cover.
Nice.
And English professor, all of that good stuff. My question is, how do you keep the recording schedule? Because I'm on solo, and so I do all editing, do everything. So how do you guys manage that recording schedule and your teaching schedule and all the other work that comes along?
That was a question and not a comment. I just want you to feel good about that.
How do we keep our recording schedule?
How do we keep our recording schedule, especially with multiple people? Dan, I'm going to throw it to you. How do you keep your recording schedule?
Okay. So I have 2 podcasts, and right now one of them is definitely suffering
It's on
more
hiatus.
than another. What?
It's on hiatus.
It's on hiatus.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
So, but one thing is I'm trying to also be very aware of, yes, I want to keep a weekly schedule of releases. If it's not possible, I have to also release that pressure of doing that. And the reason is because a podcast, and this is why I like podcasting, it's an archival. So even if I release an episode later, someone's going to come across it and be able to listen to it whenever they want. And a lot of times I think of it that way. It's this is something that someone's going to be able to listen to whenever they want. So I might be upset that, oh man, I didn't get this episode out on time. Most likely it's not going to get listened to in that day. It might get listened to next week, because a lot of times I'll release a new episode. The episode last time that I released, that gets listened to way more than the next one for some reason. And then it's the cycle happens like that. And also I use newsletters to kind of maybe in there, when I come back, I'll apologize for being away. But I have to just be able to kind of go, what's important? What do I have to do? And I'm really bad at this. And I'm not really, and I try to stay as, calm as possible with it. But it's also difficult when you're a one-person project on one podcast. It's just me writing remix, all of it, and then the next one it's me and my co-host, and he takes care of what he takes care of, and I take care of what I take care of. Mainly the editing and a lot of scheduling and things like that. But people, I think I just have to just understand what I am, and I'm an independent podcast that does not have the funding from the university. Does not have access to a studio. I don't have a production team. So I just have to act as that and be okay with that sometimes, and that's takes a long time. It took a long time for me to be okay with that, because I really don't want to be okay with that. I want to be releasing every week, no problem, on the nose, but it's sometimes impossible.
And the students want you to keep going to class.
And the students want their papers.
Also annoying.
The students want their feedback. They want you to answer their emails right away. So sometimes, I just got to go, what am I getting paid for? I'm not getting paid to podcast. I would love to. And I love making that argument, being this is the most important thing, but it's not doing anything other than, it's doing something, but it's not this other thing, which makes sure that exists. Yeah.
I was hearing you say, oh, someone can listen to this anytime. I'm that must be nice.
Because you're under a whole other type of pressure.
Our content, and I did this to myself, or I did this to us, sorry, is more time sensitive because we're tied to award season. It's sort of the SAG Awards are tomorrow night. If we're not talking about that on Monday or Tuesday, no one cares. And same thing with new releases. There's a window in which, especially with the film nerds, they're I saw this opening weekend. Where's your episode about it, right? That implies that we have lots of listeners. So maybe that's not a good way to say that. But but the one, and so it's hard. And honestly, the real answer for me at least is sleep less. To be honest, I'm editing at night before I go to bed and making the rest of my family mad because they're why are you still awake? But the other thing that helps, because regular recording is the hardest thing. What we have done, and when we haven't done this, it becomes a lot more squirrely, is we have a time and a date that works for everybody, day of the week, that we just block off on our calendars. And that has helped immensely, and my teaching schedules changed, and I was like, hey, can we switch it around? And then everything imploded. And now we're like doing doodle polls, and I'm like, it's ridiculous. And so, you know, when we have that sort of blocked off, like, and every once in a while someone has something going on during that time, and then we can adjust. But if you have the standing recording time, and then you know it's going to take a couple days to edit and get it posted, and then the listeners know it's always going to be Wednesday. I mean, I'm saying that like we actually do that. We don't. We're pretty inconsistent. But that's what we'd like to do, and that's what we should be doing, and we try to do it as best we can. But that has really helped. And then it's sort of like, then the only question mark is, what are we talking about that day? Mm-hmm. Right? And planning the schedule of like, okay, this movie's coming out this time. Now we gotta. So that needs to be talked about this episode, right? Yeah. But yeah, PT.
I think that having the set time helps. It also helps that there are 4 of us. So as long as 2 people can make it, there's an episode.
I mean, that helps you.
It helps me. That's right, because Jen's always one of the people. But basically, if Jen says like, these are the times that work for me, these are the times that I can do it, it's on the rest of us to figure out. You know, because Jen is doing
we tap
so much.
In and out, yeah.
Jen is doing so much of the work that it's sort of, we just sort of orbit around that schedule, and then you know, jump in when necessary. And you know, so we have three of us, and I say that as if I'm not the 4th. Have young children, and so there's like childcare issues. So yeah, basically I'm frequently on because I'm just like, I got nothing going on. I don't know. I fed my cat. I'm good. I'm ready to go. Do you want to start at 5? Great. You want to start at 9? Sure. And it's somewhat dependent upon when Jen is doing it, and then you know, there's also sometimes you gotta sacrifice. You gotta be like, oh, we're not doing an episode on that, or like we've got some movies that are in the sort of orbit of, these are important for us to cover. They're all nominated for a bunch of Oscars, or you know, we really cared about them. And like, we recently just released a review of All of Us Strangers, which is an excellent movie if you all haven't seen it. And Antonio, especially our co-host Antonio, was like, I need to talk about this movie. It was so important to me. But it was out for a while. So we waited until it was coming out it's on Hulu now. Mm-hmm. So we waited till it's coming to streaming. We found like another way, and just sacrifice that we were going to have it when it came out. And there's some other times that we had ideas, and the ideas just haven't clicked. So I think that it's trying to be set. It's trying to be very rigid and also trying to be very flexible. It's that kind of contradiction that I'm always telling my students, but and it infuriates them. But yeah, it's sort of, I think it's that. It's sort of be strict about scheduling it, but then also be flexible about who can make it, what's going to be covered, and sometimes we miss a week, and that's. So be it.
Right, and that's like Dan said, just make your peace with, it's not always going to be perfect and on time.
There's a lot of professional podcasters and really produced podcasts that don't release every week. Sometimes they miss a week. Sometimes they miss 2 weeks. So and then so it's not out of the ordinary. I'm saying, you know what I mean. So, and the other thing is, like, we've tried to batch record. So like on one recording date, we might record 2-3 episodes. So now I'm good, and I can wait. I don't have to record, so I can just edit and then go, okay, we don't have to record the next 2 weeks. Like, we're good. I have a bunch of backlog, and I can release that and go, when do you want to record in this month? And then just kind of like, okay, we're going to do these 2 episodes here, these 3 episodes on this day, and then we're good for another month possibly. So we're always try to keep, at least at this point, it's now 4 episodes backlogged. I would like it a little more than that, and Writing Remix only has 1 at this point, so that's kind of like freaking me out. But like, we want to start recording new episodes for that. But I think it's you just make peace with the fact that like it's not going to always be every week. Possibly, I did do once a week when I first started, and it was mind bending to kind of get that work finished. It was really difficult. It was very difficult.
Another question. Okay.
You've talked a tiny bit already about recruiting all these awesome international scholars, and you've talked a little bit about your awesome listeners, which who knows how many are. So I'm curious about your recruitment process, and I'm curious about the kinds of fan interactions that happen. Like, do you have a Discord? What do you got?
So the question was about fan interaction and how we
Yeah, it's basically interacting with fans and interacting with guests.
Sure.
And sort of recruiting international scholars. So yeah, no, it was really well combined. And so we haven't had as many guests, so I'll talk listeners first, and what's helpful is the podcast grew out of Jen's Substack, so that's sort of the that newsletter and that website blog is the home base, so that there's a lot of the comments come on there. So we don't have there was the part of the question was, is there a Discord? We're not at that level yet. We have Substack comments and Instagram replies to some of our posts. We also have, because we're covering movies, we're all on Letterboxd, which is saying something because both Antonio and I generally issue social media. So we've decided this is an okay social media of just putting up diaries of movies you've seen and reviews there. And so we have some listeners and some former guests of the guests we have had on the show who will sort of comment there, and we've got a tag for our reviews, and we're trying to get people who listen to the show to tag anything that they've heard about on our show that then they watch. So we're doing some interactions there, and then we also I think like all of us have had the experience of just some person I went to college with sent me a text that was just sort of like, oh, hey, like I was really glad to listen to like this show about this movie. Like, it was great. You haven't changed, which I don't know if that was good or bad, but that was, it was good to, you sort of have that. So yeah, we don't have like a concentrated listener hub beyond Jen Substack. We may need to get more listeners to have it be hub worthy, but yeah, I think we are encouraging people to contact us, and we like when we hear from folks and try to bring them into the conversation.
Yeah, and I say we just recently got our first real, we've never met them, listener, commenter, dare I say fan. Shout out to Hasib if you're listening to this. And it was really exciting because we were like, people are listening and they're leaving comments and they want to engage, and it was really exciting. We eventually figured out it was a mutual friend, but not one that I had met, and so it counts. And so I think it's slow going on that front. Substack does really help a lot because we have like a subscriber base there that like I see the analytics and the I mean, I don't look at them that often, but they're known quantities, right? I have email addresses. I don't have names, but I have email addresses and how often they're clicking on our links and downloading our episodes and stuff like that.
Well, that's
so
it's good. That's good to know.
I think that's just the tip of the iceberg for what most shows and/or corporations do. So I think.
Dan, how do you manage your guests as well as your listeners?
Because you have way more guests than we do.
So yeah, I'm writing Remix. I started with the people that I work with. it was the obvious choice because everyone was doing amazing work, and I felt like it would be great to have this platform to kind of, put that work out there. So that was one part. Then it's like asking them, do they know anyone that would also like to be on the podcast? The CFP that I put out on the UPenn website, that was super successful because every academic is looking for a way to talk about their work other than writing and being at a panel. It costs nothing for them to be on the podcast. Right. They don't have to travel. They just go right on Zoom and they're here. And so that was the best thing I could have done for writing Remix. The other thing is I will just reach out straight to people that I feel like, and I'm getting better at it now, but when I would reach out to people I knew being like, oh, they would be perfect for this idea. Would you like to be on? And they would be yes. Okay. And most times people say yes. I would say it's easier in the academic world to get guests. They want to talk. Now, on the other side with the nostalgia test, the CFP helped there too. That's how I got all those guests. There was no other way I was getting them. In terms of like other guests, people have reached out. Like recently, we're going to be doing an episode with a director of some movie coming out, and their publicist reached out to us. So we've had that happen a couple times where someone did reach out and go, hey, the Nickelodeon documentary, which everyone should see, The Orange Years, it was on Hulu. It's an amazing film. they reached out to us and said, hey, would you like to have him on? And we were like, of course. We didn't even feel worthy to have this person on the podcast. And we were like, yes, that would be great. Let's have him on. And then once you had that, like, you can use that and go, hey, we had this director on. Would you like to also be on? But it's a lot of sometimes emailing and getting no responses from people. In terms of our fans and listeners, we get comments. There are a lot of people that listen to the podcast. It's a good amount, I think, for an independent podcast. But recently on YouTube, the episodes are going up audio through YouTube. They want to do it themselves now. And we did an episode about Grandma got run over by a reindeer, that amazing Christmas Carol. And then we said some stuff about it. There was a comment left on it from the guy who wrote the song. And I thanked him for being a good sport. That was like the first thing I said. I was like, thank you for being a good sport, blah, blah, blah. He said something very nice. He's like, oh, I never noticed that the lyrics look that way. And I said, email us if you want to be on the podcast. And he emailed us right away. So like sometimes it's organic and it just kind of happens. And especially in the nostalgia space and in pop culture, it's so saturated. And there are so many choices for people to be on podcasts. It's really hard to break through. But the other thing is, like, the Nostalgia Test is a different type of podcast. It's about friends also hanging out. So we like to have our friends on. Like, we just have our friends on talking, and we talk about movies, and some of them are better than others, and so we have them on multiple times. But the thing is, I still believe podcasting is very new still in terms of the way it is. So people just also don't know what it is. So you just have to talk them through it and be okay with that. And the other thing is just consistency. I would say knowing which social media works best. I've found that, like, TikTok has been way easier. I get way more engagement on TikTok than I do on Instagram. If I put a poll up on TikTok to ask, like, hey, which movie should we do next, Twister or Clueless, I'm going to get people voting on TikTok immediately. On Instagram, it takes forever, because the algorithm's different. So you have to just kind of pick and choose what you put out there. But if you just cold email people, you'll get responses sometimes, And just also, one last thing, like doing like podcast crossovers with other podcasters, that helps a ton. So like we're trying to set some up with a couple now, and we do guest spots. We did a couple guest spots on a couple. There's one podcast, Buzz in the Tower, who do 80s and 90s films, and they had us talk about Independence Day. We sent in a clip, they chopped it up however they wanted, and they put it in there, and that helped us. So we're doing that as much as we can. I think it helps being over 100 episodes. It kind of shows people that, oh, this podcast is serious. It takes 100 episodes.
I'll also say, from the flip side, being an active listener for a podcast you like is the best way to become a podcaster. Yeah. Because that's how I got into this whole mess. Was I was listening to a Star Wars podcast called The Rebel Base Card, and I was a listener, and my friend from grad school, who's one of our 4 regular co-hosts, Greg, they actually, I was like constantly engaging and leaving comments and talking to them on social media and all that, and they actually started like responding on the show, and then eventually they were like, oh, whenever you want to come on, you should come on. And they're like, maybe we should have asked her before we were on air. And that's how it all started. I was a guest on their show, and then I kind of caught the bug, and then was like, hey, maybe I could do my own show. And so yeah, I think, and like a guest appearing on other podcasts, if you are a podcaster, is promotional currency, is what
Absolutely.
I would say. So it's like, that's the best way to get enthusiastic people on your show.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We have more questions. I'm going to note I'm advancing the slide. That's not because we're ending. We still have time. But I just realized we should put our contact information up as the slide. So, yes.
Yeah, go ahead. So the question is, do we write for our podcast, or is it just mainly expert?
Right, just like
extemporaneous.
Like this.
It's been a long day.
It's been a long day. Extemporaneous.
2 microphone wires worth of stress that just broke you.
I'll answer the question kind of in 2 parts. One is to clarify, for our show, because I have the Substack that's housing our podcast, I'm also publishing my own written reviews on there. So that's what, when we were talking about writing earlier, that's probably what you heard. And so it's sort of like, one post a week will be our episode for the week, and then the other post will be like a review that I'm just writing about something. And but in terms of that's not to say that no writing is involved in preparing for a podcast. Quite the opposite. So what we do is our first line of defense is a shared Google Doc. And what I have done over time is sort of created a template with the structure of like, okay, first we do our opening, then we share our what we call the short take, our initial impressions, then we're doing recommendation algorithm, then we're going into announcing spoiler mode. So there's a formula that we've sort of developed over time that I have just like a set template of like, okay, this is the order in which we're doing stuff. And then depending on the film we're reviewing or the topic for that particular episode, I will go in and fill in specific questions. I usually try to write out a script for our entire opening, because that actually, for some reason, is like has the most margin of chaos. So that makes me feel better about it. And we do like a goofy bit where we like make oblique references to the movie, and then the person it's a call and answer thing where the person responding will have a quote out of context from the movie that's usually really ridiculous. And so that we sort of try to plan ahead and map out and write out beforehand. But otherwise, it's just sort of questions that are sort of prompting conversation, I think, right? Yeah,
it's usually the questions that are written, or maybe some points that, or like we want to make sure we bring this up, and I find in terms of my contributions to the Google Doc is if I go and I look something up of some sort of like arc of film history or background on, well, here's like what's happened with this person before, is writing that out, and sometimes writing it out just in like a list. Sometimes it's full sentences. And
it's called research.
It is called research, and then putting that in there. You're right. That's what it looks like in the letter, to the promotion letter. But yeah, and I think that we also, like, I think the three of us co-hosts like also have our secret files, our secret docs, yes, of like, well, we write out our short takes and write out some of the things that we want to say, but we don't want Jen to see it right away, so or everyone else to see it, so it's a surprise. But yeah, so I think we sort of start from that structured written base, and then it mostly becomes conversational.
It's actually not unlike preparing to teach a class, at least for me.
Yep.
It's like you got a plan in case things go south, but then you can go off book if you need to.
Right.
Yeah, I would say with the nostalgia test, like a lot of the writing has to do with taking notes while watching a movie, especially like where are the and also coming up with like, does this pass and why does it? So we don't just go, it fails, end of episode. Like there's a reason and we have to go through it. But the writing is like, it has a role. Note taking, when, questions that I might, write to the side in case like things do, because our podcast is very tangent filled a lot of times. So I have to kind of like, get it back into a space somewhere. And also, when we watched every Rocky film, which was a big mistake because there was a lot of watching and a lot of work, we kept writing down the rankings. So we have to remember how we ranked the film. So it also is to remember certain things, so that when we go into another episode, we understand where we stood lately, where we're standing now. And then when we set up the post, it's like writing descriptions, having the quotes, writing the newsletter. Like, so writing does play a huge role. And I think when I teach this with students and I talk about it, they just think that they pop on a mic and they talk. And I'm like, writing has a huge role to podcasting, because you wouldn't know what the episode is about. You got to write a title. You got to write hashtags. When you do the social media, you have to, with the writing remix, when I do that newsletter, I write a whole note that has nothing to do with the episode, but comes off the episodes, like inspired by it. And I write prompts that people can do in terms of like the theme of it. So I have a role for writing in determining for each podcast. And it's like, and sometimes if I don't do that, especially the note taking, the episode can kind of like run off the rails. So you really have to kind of like, I don't overdo it, but I want to have, it's like a good medium. But yeah, writing plays a big role in a lot of the production.
It's like a perfect segue to my last question.
Yes.
Which is kind of selfish and hopefully not too unfair to ask.
So the question is, do all our podcasts come with transcripts? So with the writing remix, I just started doing transcripts last year. And the reasoning, and the reason for me was I was trying to find a way to do it that wasn't going to cost me a ton of money, because it's not cheap, right? And also the time, if I had, depending on, so now I use Descript, and Descript transcribes the audio and the video. It's not absolutely perfect, but it transcribes it well enough. I do edit as much of it as I can until like I'm like, I have to finish and I have to get this out. So the Writing Remix has transcripts, I think, starting last year, I believe. Now the writing, the nostalgia test, I have transcripts and I'm just trying to figure out how to post them, because on Podbean it's a little different. That's how I host that one. So on WordPress is where I have a website for Writing Remix. So I can just input the PDF of the transcript there. So I'm trying to come up with like either doing it on Medium and just copying and pasting the Nostalgia Test transcript right into Medium and like having it there, or put it in the newsletter as a file for people to download. But I don't have transcripts for every episode. And that podcast, can be so chaotic that I know the transcript will be a little much harder to kind of engage. Though because we're also on YouTube, there are captions that come up on YouTube. So that helps in one regard. So I'm always saying like the episode, like all the episodes are on YouTube, here, and here. So on YouTube that you can get captions at least. And also sometimes a transcript, like depending on it. Yeah. So yeah, it's been something that we talked about in the Humanities Podcast Network, like how to make sure every podcast has transcripts and not make it such a barrier to make people like this is all out of pocket to be able to do it, because I want my listeners to be able to, pull from it, or people who, aren't able to listen to it can follow along as well. So it is something that I think about.
We hadn't been until, I want to say it was in the past month, Substack started doing it automatically. I have not, and thank you for your question, because I'm going to write down check to make sure that's real, because I see when I uploaded the episode, I see it's like generating a transcript, but I haven't on the user end sort of gone to check to see what that looks like. So it could be terrible, I don't know. But that was a really nice thing, because I was really worried about that from an accessibility perspective. And so it was nice that Substack was sort of like, hey, we're doing this now, generate a transcript. And I'm like, great. But I don't know, if it's anything like Zoom, it's probably terrible, but.
And we also, because we've been spending the conference time with Dan, learned about the YouTube upload function. So now it's on YouTube. So we also would have the automatically generated closed captioning transcript, which is not great, but is at least not nothing. But yeah, hopefully the Substack one is working. Yeah, great question.
Absolutely.
It is. It's something that, especially if anyone here or anyone listening is like, oh, I want to start a podcast. That's something that would be great to not say, oh, after like a year we started doing it. Like it would be great to have done it from the beginning. Yeah. So it's
and it is difficult, especially with the in terms of the software that you're using. Like when I have international guests, a lot of the captions and a lot of the transcriptions, it doesn't catch everything very well. So it is very difficult to kind of get through, and I want to offer as much of it as I can. So I'm thinking slowly, if I have the time to go back and like do that. Though I can upload the Writing Remix to YouTube at this point, and hopefully like start there at least. So there are ways in which to do it, and and it's not like I'm hiding that there's no transcript, because like when you go to the new ones, it's like they're transcripts now, and so like it's like hopefully I can get to a point where I can offer transcripts for everything. So. It's and it's. Mm-hmm. It's a journey, and it's also like it's interesting. When I started doing this and that came up, I started looking at my options. I'm like, am I on top of my hosting, on top of everything else? I'm like, I felt bad like making those choices monetarily, and it is conversations that I always have and try to think like, how can I get this? But once I started with Descript is really, and they're constantly updating the software. So Descript has been a real a real gift to like my editing process and everything else.
We have to transcribe by hand.
Oh my God, transcript by hand? No.
Are there any last questions? We have a couple of minutes left in this room before they throw us out. Are
And
there
just
any?
so our listeners know, this room is packed.
Oh. It's more people kept coming in. No one left.
No.
It's the benefit of the audio medium.
Yep.
Exactly. But yeah, are there any more questions or comments or anything?
I have some colleagues you should do crossovers with.
Please.
Oh,
Yes.
we would love that.
All professors play, so like, if you play video games at all,
Hello.
you could be on it.
Okay.
Amazing.
Yeah, we're going to touch base with some of these people in the audience, I think, after the
absolutely.
panel to get contact
Yeah.
info to try to get them
Yeah, please.
guesting on our shows.
Question?
Please.
Go ahead.
I would love to know from a creative standpoint, what is your favorite part about either of your podcasts and getting to teach while simultaneously fulfilling your creative endeavors at the same time?
So the question is, what is our favorite part about the creative endeavor and our teaching? Like about what is the best part of our creative endeavor for our
Does it have to include teaching? No, I'm just kidding.
My answer can. Go ahead.
No, that was a joke. That was a joke. Well, okay, I will answer, but I'm worried that I'm basically stealing Jen's answer because we've both said this back and forth, which is just like, it's nice to have a guaranteed reason to talk to our friends about this. And, like there's the constant lamentation about the lack of third space in people's lives. And I think that if you have a regular outlet like this, it is sort of a like, oh, this is a reason to get together and talk about the things that you like. Or if you didn't like something, why did you not like it? And you care about not liking it because you care about this. So that's the best part for me. The sub answer for that is, I feel like I'm generally facetious in responding to things, but it doesn't need to be crass. That sort of idea of, oh, this is helping with teaching. This feels like, I'm working the same muscles that I'm asking my students to do. Even though like I'm not writing as much as Jen is, the idea of what are the ideas I have? How do I want to frame it? How am I going to get it across? Even if it's just, I never get beyond outlines in a lot of it, because I'll just talk. But doing that feels rewarding and is a nice thing to have. And if you're when you're just sort of writing something, or even just taking notes for yourself, or if you're writing it and like putting it out on social media, but it's just you, that it can kind of feel a little bit like yelling into a void. So at least there's someone on the other side of the screen who's like nodding and listening,
or shaking their head in some cases.
Yes.
So for me, the sort of origin story of me doing this, because the Substack and my written reviews preceded the podcast, and the reason I started doing it was because I had written a textbook manuscript with a couple of colleagues of ours, and I can't believe I'm telling the story on a recorded thing, and it completely fell through for various reasons that I won't get into, because that's the part I probably shouldn't talk about on the show.
The other people involved were I'm just kidding.
No, it just like there were circumstances it just didn't work out, and we had done all this work that I cared about in terms of the use value of it, but in terms of the actual process of writing it, it was more of a chore than doing this, right? And so what happened was I had sort of a crisis, existential writer's crisis, where I was like, what am I even doing? My time is precious. Like, why am I writing things that aren't even going to, like, no one will read? And so it was a whole thing. And basically the conclusion I came to was, I tell my students all the time, write about what you care about. And not only because it's so much easier, but because it's so much more fulfilling, and the writing itself will be better. And so that's sort of why I was like, I really did some soul searching about, like, what is the thing, regardless of obligation, regardless of benefit, of even promotion, even though we did talk about how you can do that. What is the thing that's really going to be creative, like you said, creatively rewarding? And pop culture reviews was sort of what I landed on, and it really has helped me so that I'm not a hypocrite when I'm telling my students, you got to figure out what you care about. You got to find the motivation to write. Why do we write? Right? Like a lot of us ask that in our classes as a discussion to help students sort of like get more engaged in the process. And now I can sort of say that I have done that. So it's really nice.
Dan?
I like having a classroom that's my own. I think like the writing remix is like my own personal classroom. I've learned so much from other people that came and talked about their content and talked about their ideas. And it also like a place to kind of, I learned so much about myself. I think like having to talk and like express my ideas and be out there much more than being in the classroom and talking or going to conferences. It's really a question of like, how much do I believe in the things that I'm saying, and am I willing to kind of put it out into the public? Like, and that's been a real interesting challenge, but it's also been really fulfilling. And with the nostalgia test, it's like being 3,000 miles away from all the people that I grew up with and like my friends and stuff, it's a nice way for me to kind of hang out with them, and also for us to kind of see, because we've been friends for over 20 years. So it's like we've changed in so many ways, but like when we come together, it's like this fun kind of group hang, but we could still get into serious conversations, which has really been the most surprising part. When we talk about these movies, we know we're having fun, but we're also kind of going, well, what are we connecting to, and why is that? You know, is it because like how old we are at this point, and when we saw it, we were this age? So there's a lot of interesting things going on that I feel I'm getting a lot out of, and it's just also like I love writing, but I also love talking, probably a little more than writing. So it's a good way for me to kind of get my scholarship out at the same time. So when I need to do that, I have the podcast to be able to do that. So it's been quite fulfilling in many ways. I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Yep. And for listening, everyone. Thank you so much. You can follow the Nostalgia Test podcast everywhere you get your podcasts, and follow us on Instagram at the Nostalgia Test, and on X at Nostalgia Test. Long Take Review.
You can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Threads and Instagram, our sole little nub of social media, at the Long Take Review. And then on Letterboxd, I am at P.T. McNiff, PTMCNIFF.
And I am at Qui-Gon Jen. You can also, this is not up there, I think, but you can also follow me on Threads and Instagram at Sopchockchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI. And do you want to bother talking about the letterbox tag?
Sorry, Greg.
Yeah. If you want to email us too, take down our information. If you want to email us, we're willing to share our information, share the slides. And also if you want to be on any of the podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
You're going to end up on a mailing list, though. They'll just let you know. We're going to email you. But please leave it anyway.
That was so much fun. Listening back, you can hear the joy in our voices, and also just like learning how to do this live. Hopefully we could do more live in-person podcasts, so we're definitely down. You reach out to us. All our information is in the show notes. Follow both podcasts on Instagram and on Instagram. Follow us at the Nostalgia Test at the Nostalgia Test on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads, on X at Nostalgia Test. Join the newsletter for quotes and special notes and all sorts of things that you don't get through the regular episode. Follow the Long Take Review. Follow the Substack and the podcast. The link is in the show notes. Please support indie podcasts. The best thing you can do for us as independent podcasters is to follow, share, and review the work that we do. It's really hard to get our voices out there, so please share this podcast with everyone you know. And also a special thank you to my co-host at the Nostalgia Test podcast, Manny Coelho, for not only going on this insane podcast journey, but also being an amazing, inquisitive scholar himself, for asking amazing questions on Nostalgia 101, for pushing the creative envelope with me when it comes to what we can do, and definitely looking forward to more episodes on that platform. And everyone, and thanks again to Southwest Popular Culture. Looking forward to next year, and everyone, peace.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to the Nostalgia Test podcast to know when new episodes drop. Don't forget to leave us 5 stars and a positive review so more people can find the podcast. Share your thoughts and memories on today's topic on our Twitter @NostalgiaTest and on Instagram @TheNostalgiaTest. Tune in next time because you never know what pop culture will pop up on The Nostalgia Test.